Welcome! Today I'm going to read the second part of Chapter 4 of The Call of the Wild. Chapter 4 is called Who Has Won to Mastership? A Scotch half-breed took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, he started back over the weary trail to Dawson. It was no light running now, nor record time, but heavy toil each day with a heavy load behind. For this was the mail train, carrying word from the world to the men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. Buck did not like it, but he bore up well to the work, taking pride in it after the manner of Dave and Sulcles, and seeing that his mates, whether they prided in it or not, did their fair share. It was a monotonous life operating with machine-like regularity. One day was very like another. At a certain time each morning the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then, while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were under way an hour or so before darkness, which gave warning of dawn. At night, camp was made. Some pitched the files, others cut firewood and pine box for the bed, and still others carried water or ice for the cooks. Also the dogs were fed. To them, this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around after the fish was eaten for an hour or so with the other dogs, of which there were 50 and odd. There were fierce fighters among them, but 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so that he was bristled and showed his teeth. They got out of his way. Best of all, perhaps, he loved to lie near the fire. Hind legs crouched under him, 4 legs stretched out in front, head raised and eyes blinking dreamily in the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and of Cement's swimming tank, and Isabel and the Mexican hairless, and Toots the Japanese pug. But oftener he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. The Southland was very dim and distant, and such memories had no power over him. For more potent were the memories of his heredity that gave to things he had never seen before, seemingly familiarity, the instincts, which were but memories of his ancestors, became habits, which had lapsed in later days and still later in him, quickened and became alive again. Sometimes he crouched there, blinking dreamily in the flames. It seemed that the flames were of another fire, and that he crouched by this other fire. He saw another and different man from the half-breed cook before him. This other man was shorter of leg and longer of arm, with muscles that were stringy and knotty rather than rounded and swelling. The hair of this man was long and matted, and his head sounded back under it from the eyes. He uttered strange sounds and seemed very much afraid of the darkness, into which he peered continually, clutching in his hand, which hung midway between the knee and foot, a stick with heavy stone made fast to the end. He was all but naked, a ragged and fire-scorched skin hanging part way down his back, but on his body there was much hair. In some places across the chest and shoulders, and down the outside of the arms and thighs, it was matted into almost thick fur. He did not stand erect, but with trunk inclined forward from the hips, on legs that bent at the knees. About his body there was a particular springiness or resiliency, almost cat-like, and a quick alertness, as if one who lived in perpetual fear of things he had seen and unseen. At other times this hairy man squatted by the fire with head between his legs and slept. On such occasions his elbows were on his knees, and his hands clasped above his head, as though to shed rain by the hairy arms. And beyond that fire, in the circling darkness, Buck could see many gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2, which he knew to be the eyes of great beasts of prey. And he could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth, and the noises they made in the night, and dreaming there by Yukon bank with lazy eyes blinking at the fire, these sounds and sights of another world would make the hair to raise along his back and stand on end across his shoulders and up his neck, till he whimpered low and suppressingly, or growled softly, and the half-breed cook shouted at him, "Hey, you buck, wake up!" Whereupon the other world would vanish, the real world came to his eyes, and then he would get up and yawn and stretch as though he had been asleep. It was a hard trip with the mail behind them, and the heavy work wore them down. They were short of weight and in poor condition when they made Dawson, and should have been a 10 days or week's rest at least. But in 2 days' time, they dropped down the Yukon bank from the barracks, loaded with letters from the outside. The dogs were tired, the drivers grumbling, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail, greater friction on the runners, and heavier pulling for the dogs. Yet the drivers were fair, though, through it all. They did their best for the animals. Each night the dogs were attended to first. They ate before the drivers ate, and no man sought his sleeping robe until he had seen it to the feet of the dogs he drove. Still, their strength went down. Since the beginning of the winter, they had traveled 1,800 miles, dragging sleds the whole weary distance, and 1,800 miles will tell upon life of the toughest. Buck stood it, keeping his mates up to their work and maintaining discipline, though he too was very tired. Billy cried and whimpered regularly in his sleep each night. Joe was sourer than ever, and Suckleys was unapproachable, blind side or other side. But it was Dave who suffered most of all. Something had gone wrong with him. He became more morose and irritable, and when camp was pitched, at once made his nest, where his driver fed him. Once out of the harness and down, he did not get on his feet again until harness up time in the morning. Sometimes in the traces, when jerked by a sudden stoppage the sled or by straining to start it, he would cry out with pain. The driver examined him, but could find nothing. All the drivers became interested in his case. They talked about it over mealtime and over their last pipes before going to bed. And one night they held a consultation. He was brought from his nest to the fire and was pressed and prodded until he cried out many times. Something was wrong inside, but they could locate no broken bones. Could not make it out. By the time Cesar Bar was reached, he was so weak that he was falling repeatedly in the traces. The Scotch half-breed called it a halt and took him out of the team, making the next dog, Suckleys, fast to the sled. His intention was to rest Dave, letting him run free behind the sled. Sick as he was, Dave resented being taken out, grunting and growling while the traces were unfastened, and whimpering broken-heartedly when they saw Suckleys in the position that he had held and served for so long. For the pride of trace and trial was his, and sick unto his death, he could not bear that another dog should do his work. When the sled started, he floundered in the soft snow alongside the beaten trail, attacking Suckleys with his teeth, rushing against him and trying to thrust him off into the snow onto the other side, striving to leap inside the traces and get between him and the sled, and all the while whimpering and yelping and crying with grief and pain. The half-breed tried to drive him away with the whip, but he paid no heed to the stinging lash, and the man had not the heart to strike harder. Dave refused to run quietly on the trail behind the sled, where the going was easy, but continued to flounder alongside in the soft snow, where the going was most difficult, till exhausted. Then he fell and lay where he fell, howling as the long train of sleds turned by. With the last remnant of his strength, he managed to stagger along behind till the trail made another stop. When he floundered past the sleds to his own, where he stood alongside Suckleys, his driver lingered a moment to get to the light for his pipe from the man behind. Then he returned and started his dogs. They swung out on the trail with remarkable lack of exertion, turned their heads uneasily, and stopped in surprise. The driver was surprised too. The sled had not moved. He called his comrades to witness the sight. Dave had bitten through both of Stokely's traces and was standing directly in front of the sled in his proper place. He pleaded with his eyes to remain there. The driver was perplexed. His comrades talked of how a dog could break its heart through being denied the work that killed it, and recalled instances they had known where dogs too old for the toil or injured had died because they were cut out of the traces. Also, they held it mercy since Dave was to die anyways, and he should die in the traces, heart easy and content. So he was harnessed in again, and proudly he pulled as of old. Through more than once he cried out involuntarily from the bite of his inward hurt. Several times he fell down and was dragged in the traces, and once the sled ran upon him, so that he limped thereafter on one of his hind legs. But he held out until camp was reached, when his driver made a place for him by the fire. Morning found him too weak to travel. At harness up time, he tried to crawl to his driver, but convulsed efforts, he got on his feet, staggered and fell. Then he wormed his way forward, slowly towards where the harnesses were being put on his mates. He would advance his forelegs and drag up his body with a sort of hitching movement. When he would advance his forelegs and hitch again for a few more inches, his strength left him, and the last of his mates saw of him. He lay gasping in the snow and yearning towards them. But they could hear him mournfully howling until they passed out of sight behind a belt of river timber. Here the train was halted. The Scotch of half-breed slowly retraced his steps to the camp they had left. The men ceased talking. A revolver shot rang out. The man came back hurriedly. The whip snapped and the bells tinkled merrily, and the sleds turned along the trail. But Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had taken place behind the belt of river trees. That concludes the end of chapter 4 of The Call of the Wild. Today's question is, what happens to Dave at the end of chapter 4?